going to talk about the general landscape of the guidance and policies which the government has come out with, and that will then be followed by a kind of the second half of the session being about the sharp end of delivery by local government. So at the moment, we've got guidance from the Department for Transport for local authorities in England, which came out, statutory guidance on measures to take within the context of COVID-19 traffic management measures. The Scottish Government has also set up a fund and recommended measures, and the Welsh Government has something very similar too. So it's across Britain we have that. And the only other thing I'm going to say is we're going to hear from two speakers in this session. So that's all I've got to say. Let's go to our first speaker, who is Robert Huxford, Director of the Urban Design Group, which is a membership organisation that promotes raising design standards in urban areas. Over to you, Robert.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. I'll now share my screen and start the presentation. So I hope you can all see reallocating road space in response to COVID-19. How will local authorities respond? So we had hoped that the Department for Transport would speak at this event, but the message was that they were too busy and working flat out. Now I'm struggling to find the slide. There we go. So what I'm going to do is actually two presentations. One is if the Department for Transport were here, this is, I think, what they would say, and then I'm going to say something. My feelings, my reflections about what needs to be done. So you don't waste your time. Here are my conclusions. What we need is fast urban change for life-saving streets. The statutory guidance that the Department for Transport has produced, it applies to the Traffic Management Act network management duty. The essence there is that the measures must be network-wide and not piecemeal. Because there are so few resources available to local authorities, it's implicit that what's needed is quick and dirty measures so that we get this network-wide response. There is little time before traffic builds up to higher levels and a more aggressive driving style. The statutory guidance says it looks for action within weeks and not months. Now, months starts with 2 months. A month is a month, 2 months is months. So that means that they're expecting action within less than 2 months. The statutory guidance was produced on the 9th of May, and 2 months on is the 9th of July. And we're already, well, as from Saturday, we'll be 2 weeks on from the publication. So here's what I'm going to cover. The DFT bit, there's the temporary guidance, all the things that they've done, basically. Temporary guidance on advertisement of traffic regulation orders, the statutory guidance, the green and active travel package. I'm not going to go into that in any great detail, as there seems to be a lot of confusion as to whether this is additional money or not. The letter that was sent round to local authorities, and also the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government sending a separate guidance for the owners and operators of urban centres and green spaces. And then on my bit, what I think we need is detailed guidance for local authorities on what to do. It's a sort of emergency street action plan. We don't need 100 or more transport or highway authorities each reinventing the wheel. There's a great opportunity to share expertise and understanding of what needs to be done. There are standard types of location. There are standard street widths, even originating from the Victorian period and earlier. So it should be possible to develop a standard range of solutions that can be applied in standard locations. So that's what I'm going to be recommending right at the end. So off we go. Lockdown was on the 23rd of March and we're 60 days in. What has the Department for Transport done? 21st of April, it produced guidance, temporary guidance on advertising traffic regulation orders during the coronavirus episode. And the issues it saw was about advertising by local newspapers have moved to online only. where to stick notices on affected roads. There was a consultation on the notification of traffic regulations orders in 2012 that followed on from a report that was produced by the Chartered Institute of Highways and Transportation for the UK Roads Liaison Group in 2010, and it recommended a lot of streamlining that should take place. In 2012, the Department for Transport, the Minister, Secretary of State, decided that nothing would be changed at that stage. 9th of, somebody's got a mic on. Can you help? The statutory guidance was published on the 9th of May along with a suite of other measures. So I'll be going on about that in detail. It produced a set of signs that could be used to complement whatever street reallocation, road space reallocation measures are introduced. And that's the one joke in this presentation. It is a remarkably dull and tedious presentation. It contains no sex and violence. If you want sex and violence, you've got to do that in the comfort of your own homes. So, 9th of May, £2 billion package to create a new era for cycling and walking. It was announced, but there's some debate as to whether that's new funds or whether it was just a re-announcement of a previously announced package. The 12th of May, a letter to highway authorities from the Permanent Secretary, Emma Ward, Director General Roads, Places and Environment on the local transport restart. Letters are what the Department for Transport would like to happen. They don't necessarily have a legal significance, but statutory guidance does have a legal significance. A couple of days later, the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government produced non-statutory guidance on the coronavirus, safer public places, urban centres and green spaces, and it includes a number of different settings such as shopping streets and high streets outside where queuing may be likely. So that was published, but this is non-statutory. So next we go into the statutory guidance. Now, what is the legal significance of statutory guidance? One looks at the case law, the common law, and this is one of the case laws. It informs us what the status of statutory guidance is. So statutory guidance is issued by a Minister, Secretary of State, under powers that are given to him by Parliament in an Act of Parliament. And in our case, it's the Traffic Management Act, Section 2004, Section 18. But here we go. If we just read this, it says Parliament requires local authorities to follow the path charted by the Secretary of State's guidance, with liberty to deviate from it where the local authority judges on admissible grounds that there is good reason to do so, but without freedom to take a substantially different course. So note that really, really seriously. And admissible grounds isn't just a sort of whim. It's got to be something that's materially significant. So the upshot is that statutory guidance has to be followed unless there are clear and cogent reasons to depart from it. So here we go. Where does it sit, the statutory guidance? Well, we've got the network management duty, under the general duties relating to network management, and Section 18, which gives the Secretary of State the power to issue network management guidance to authorities. So it's in that context, it's about network management, and this is where our approach in responding to the statutory guidance needs to be network based. What it says, there's a ministerial foreword, it's got high level principles, there's mention of timing, and it says here, and in any event within weeks, and that's weeks and not months. Reallocating road space, it's got a list of measures, nothing too exciting there. I'm sure everybody could come up with their own list of measures, but the thing is, the importance is it's a list of measures that's in statutory guidance. It's got a list of the traffic orders and the procedures that can be followed to implement these suggested measures. The ministerial foreword, firstly. An opportunity for once-in-a-generation change on how we make short journeys. They refer to the National Travel Survey, where 40% of journeys, urban journeys, are under 2 miles. So much of local transport is basically local. talking about the health benefits of active travel, the affordability, the improvements in air quality. And this last point, the government therefore expects local authorities to make significant changes to their road layouts to give more space to cyclists and pedestrians. The high-level principles. Local authorities in areas with high levels of public transport use should take measures to reallocate road space to people walking and cycling, both to encourage active travel and to enable social distancing during restart. Measures should be undertaken as swiftly as possible and in any event within weeks, given the urgent need to change travel habits before the restart takes full effect. So those are important guiding principles to note. Reallocating road space, a list of measures. I'll leave you 10 seconds to read those. You'll be able to read it faster than I can talk through it. Okay, so nothing unexpected, and the guidance says that these are already measures that are implemented by local authorities. So nothing innovative. The innovative thing is to actually go and do it at scale on a network basis and rapidly. So coming to the end of the statutory guidance, it has a list of the procedures that can be used. They can be done under existing powers. The ones that can't be, traffic orders can be created, permanent ones are experimental or temporary. And there is also temporary traffic notices, which can be done almost instantaneously. They can be done instantaneously. It seems that a lot of local authorities are going for the experimental order approach. It stresses that the public sector equality duty still applies. It says local authorities must consider the needs of disabled people. The actual public sector equality duty says that authorities must have due regard to the need to, and due regard has a specific meaning under the common law, and it's to have it's a robust, open-minded consideration before a decision is settled on. They say the guidance will be reviewed after 3 months. So, some reflections. There is a duty to act. The statutory guidance is calling on us to act, and what we've done here is pull out other duties that appear in other branches of legislation. So under the Highways Act, section 66, subsection 1, there is a duty to provide in or by the side of a highway a proper and sufficient footway where considered necessary or desirable for the safety or accommodation of pedestrians, and there is the power to alter or remove them. The Road Traffic Regulation Act, and this is an important duty here under section 122 on the exercise of functions by local authorities. It shall be the duty of every local authority upon whom functions are conferred by or under this act, and those are road closures, road restrictions, temporary speed limits, those sorts of measures, to exercise the functions conferred on them to secure the expeditious, convenient and safe movement of vehicular and other traffic, including pedestrians. So again, a positive duty. There's the public sector equality duty. We've just covered that. If you want further information on the interpretation of the public sector equality duty, there's the case of Ali versus Newham Council 2010 at the Court of Appeal. Protected characteristics, it's not just disabled people, but it applies to age and gender as well. So we need to consider elderly people, we need to consider women as well as men, and all manners of different gender expression. There's the Road Traffic Act 1988, section 39. Each authority must, in the light of studies, etc., take such measures as appear to the authority to be appropriate to prevent such accidents. It's a positive duty. And then lastly, there's the common law duty of care. This derives from the case of Yetkin versus Newham. Again, I think the date was 2005. And it is that each authority owes a duty to all road users, whether careful or negligent, to give reasonable care in the manner in which it exercises its powers. And there are many other duties as well. There are in public health, crime, and we have climate change targets. These are positive duties that call upon local authorities to act. They're there to be balanced. They're there to be uh, enacted upon. Um, so, a great call to do some stuff, but there is not much money to do it. On the left, you can see the Barnett Graph of Doom, which was produced by Barnett Council in 2012. They were projecting projected fall in the council's budget, and the inexorable rise in the demand for adult social care as the population ages, and the increase in demand for children's services. And most recently, we now have this graph produced by the Institute for Fiscal Studies. It shows that over the past 10 years, local authority budgets have pretty much fallen by a quarter. So, and we know cases of local authorities expressing concern that they're approaching bankruptcy. Not very much money. So, if the statutory guidance is calling on a network approach, then it means that it's a sort of quick and dirty approach that is needed. So, just to recap, there is an unequivocal duty to act. The statutory guidance applies to the network management duty. The measures must be network-wide. Because there's little resources available, if we're going to get the network-wide coverage, it needs quick and dirty measures. Not necessarily dirty, but they need to be imaginative. And it's within weeks and not months. What happens if the guidance is not followed without good reason? The sanctions that could be tried by a member of the public would be to refer a local authority to the local government ombudsman, or and that costs nothing, or judicial review, and that costs a hell of a lot of money. In the old days, this simply wouldn't happen, but there are now environmental lobbies that are really very well funded. We have Client Earth, which has threatened to take almost 100 planning authorities to court over their failure to discharge the duty under the Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act 2005, the duty to have in their development plans policies that mitigate climate change, and we're talking about the zero carbon target by 2050. If there are accidents that relate to the guidance, the statutory guidance not having been followed, there is then the question about the Highway Authority being liable in negligence. So we want to avoid all that. So how to make things easier for local authorities? And the situation is really difficult. It's not just the financial resources that have been cut. Technical staff have declined in numbers over the years. There is a duty to act, but the question is what and where. And it seems to be pointless for all local authorities to go through the same churning business of establishing general principles and trying to work these through, when it would be possible for local authorities to club together to produce a package of standard measures that would apply to typical locations. It can be based on a risk management approach, looking at the benefits too, but above all, it's working towards creating a production line for fast urban change. We're talking maybe another 6 weeks to roll these things out. It's a production line that we need to think about. Think about Ford in the United States rolling out the first production line. We don't want to get into a load of analysis. What do they call it? Analysis paralysis. The UK Roads Liaison Group, it advocates the risk-based risk management approach and cites ISO 31000. And I'm not talking about using this approach in rolling out the measures, but in producing the guidance, it would be a really robust way of going about it. Establishing the risk context, identifying the risks, evaluating them, and then managing them away. Consider the policy and legal context. I'm not going to go through this, but you can see this, imagine this as a picture. We identify the risks, and it's all pretty obvious stuff. Pedestrians having to step into or walk in the carriageway to maintain an isolation distance. A cyclist swerving to avoid a pedestrian. The ability of pedestrians to judge the speed and different distance of moving traffic. Children are not well able to judge the speed of oncoming vehicles travelling at more than 20 miles an hour. They may register them as not moving at all. It's some quite devastating research there that needs to be taken really, really seriously. And going back to the common law duty to have care over negligent and careful and negligent road users, that includes children who are liable to make mistakes. We need to have regard to their abilities. And the same applies to elderly people and disabled people and wheelchair users who are also covered by the public sector equality duty.
Robert, Robert, you're on 20 minutes. Are you near the end?
Okay, I'm almost there. So there's an evaluation of the risks. You'll have seen this sort of table that's been used, and a flowchart. So what might an emergency street action plan, this centralised detailed guidance for local authorities, look like? We need a network-based plan, and I'm going to give thanks to Saskia Huizinga for producing these excellent slides, thinking about the network-based plan and at different levels, at town block, district block and neighbourhood block basis. Working up a typology of street types between high streets, calm-through routes, and for each, a standard menu of engineering measures for each street type, calm-through routes, and each related to the amount of space that's available in a particular street. And just flicking through some examples there, car-free shopping streets. These things don't need to be reinvented in each of the 100 plus highway authorities throughout England. They can be a standard palette. And on that basis, it would be possible to work out indicative costs on an area basis or a per metre basis, and using the data that we already know about street length and urban areas, it would be possible to work out at a national level how much funding would be needed.
Can I bring you to a conclusion, Robert?
This is coming to the conclusion, how to make it happen. We've got examples of in Scotland, the Scots National Road Development Guide, produced in concert by local authorities. There's software companies that produce illustrations that can demonstrate these sorts of things. There's a possibility of drawing together some tremendous collaboration here. The resources, we've got furloughed engineers and urban designers and public realm specialists. There are professional institutions, there's the professional officer associations such as TAG, LOTAG, ADEPT, and we've got people in communities as well. And in terms of materials that can be rapidly brought to bear, there are apparently 1.3 million traffic cones in the UK. Hay bales can be hired, incredibly. Lines, white lines, £2 per metre. There's ample scope to use some imagination to produce some low-cost measures that will enable space to be secured for pedestrians and cyclists. Some arguments that have been put against the measures say we don't agree with the guidance.
Robert,
Yep.
can you bring it to a conclusion, because we're going over.
I'm 2 slides away. We don't agree with the guidance. Highways maintenance don't agree. We'll lose parking revenue. Senior management don't agree. Local residents don't agree. There are all of these problems that could be encountered, but bear in mind there are the statutory duties and the common law duty. We have the legal status of the statutory guidance. There are the Wednesbury principles, which provide the basis for a judicial review. There's the notion of statutory immunity, which applies where officers and councillors act within the powers of the council in good faith and without negligence. And if a common generic guidance were produced, it would be possible to have a generic road safety assessment by competent road safety auditors. So, the conclusion, a duty to act, statutory guidance calling for measures to be network-wide, few resources, meaning that quick and dirty measures need to be taken to secure the space on a network-wide basis, and it's within weeks and not months. So basically, I think we need to create a production line for for this fast urban change, and our focus needs to be on that rather than debating the policy, debating the principles. We need to find ways of rolling this out. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Robert. That's a great rundown. The second speaker in this session is John Thompson, and John is president of the International Federation of Municipal Engineers, was a principal engineer at Perth and Kinross Council in Scotland, and was, I think, the lead author for Scotland's National Roads Development Guide that Robert referred to just then. So over to you, John.
Thanks very much. As predicted, Robert runs over time. You'll be pleased to know that I don't run over time here. I'll do quite a short one. Unfortunately, I've been tied up with my Swedish association for the last few days, so I don't have a presentation, so I'm afraid you're just going to have to listen to me droning on in my Scots accent. I think it might be worthwhile picking up on the fact that what Robert said about sharing experience, and the Roads National Development Guide in Scotland was actually quite a good example of doing precisely that. It came about with Manual for Streets when it became apparent that most local authorities didn't understand it, didn't know how to deal with it, technical details weren't quite right. So I approached SCOTS, which is the Society for Chief Officers for Transportation in Scotland, and we got together with all 32 councils and agreed that we'd put together a common guide for Scotland. That's 32 councils, which is actually a bit like trying to herd cats. It's not the easiest thing in the world to try and pull that together. Anyway, we did it after 4 years. So what we did, that this is now being adopted by most local authorities in Scotland, and because of that, it's adopted in policy across Scotland, so it's easy to deal with. Benefits of it, of course, are that it's web-based. There are various exceptions and variations to suit councils, to suit their local attributes. It's future-proofed because we have a review panel which actually works alongside it and updates it with legislation and other regulations as required. It provides clear guidance to developers so they understand precisely what's required in certain parts of Scotland as opposed to others. The guide itself just consists of an introduction. It talks about the principles of what the guide is trying to achieve. In other words, it reflects an awful lot of Manual for Streets guidance. And then it goes into the technical details, which, as Robert has already mentioned today, are pretty much standard across, if not Scotland, most of the UK. So on that basis, it's actually very useful. But it gives confidence for people trying to work with it, that they can come from any part of the UK, work in a certain area, and they know exactly what's required. It's a fast and easy way of dealing with things. I want to pick up on one or two other issues that's been talked about here just now. The government and everybody else tends to be talking just now about active travel and refers to it as cycling and walking. From an international perspective, it's got to be made clear that actually cycling and walking is two separate issues, very much so identified in various other countries. To try and deliver that, I think it's important that you've got to recognise that road space has limitations and you can only allocate what's actually capable within it. Many of the streets that I've spoken or I've seen and witnessed around the world are substantially wider than those that we find in the United Kingdom. When we've got very limited streets, trying to build in traffic, cycle lanes, pedestrian passageways, and now we've got the need for electric bicycles, electric scooters, which are going to be made legal in the country fairly soon. That does present challenges. Electric scooters, for example, I've seen in America, which will keep up with traffic leaving traffic lights. The only problem is that they've got wheels that are only about 50 millimeters in diameter, so the slightest pothole in the road and they're off, and not good results as a result of that. Most of this can be based on, most of the traffic allocation of what the space should be has to be reflected in traffic and density of passage. It's a key attribute towards it. In other words, if it's a high pedestrian area, clearly you want high pedestrian passageway. If there's a lot of cyclists, because it's a main route into city centres and such like, then obviously you want to have a reasonably wide cycle path. But there again, you've got statutory requirement to allow bin lorries and fire access for roads. So there's still got to be some allocation or consideration for this. It's interesting today because I was working with the the Swedish Association, and it became quite clear to me that most of streets have been designed basically on an individual street. That's probably given quite a lot of problems. If you've seen already in London, you'll be well aware of the fact that cycle lanes stop and start fairly arbitrary based on the amount of work that's actually been carried out. But to actually deal with the road space issue, I think, in my opinion, we really have to adopt a strategic approach. And when I say a strategic, I'm considering things like grid layout, where certain streets would be allocated for cyclists, other streets would be allocated for vehicles. Pedestrians, obviously, would be the mode of transport that's preferred in the UK. Actually, on that subject, considering other countries, Netherlands and Denmark, I think it would be fair to actually point out that they're prioritising cycling over pedestrian passage. Their cycling is basically designed round about commuting and for leisure. The type of vehicles that they use, or bicycles that they use, are slightly different to the ones that you see in the UK. My own concerns are that sometimes the cycle lanes are used as a spin class workout rather than actually a commuting lane. So we've got a problem here with varying speeds of vehicles. I think it's only things that you can actually think about in a rounded way. To try and deliver something quickly is going to be a challenge. And most of this coronavirus has actually brought together an opportunities, as they say, never let a good crisis ruin a good opportunity. And IFME, the International Federation of Municipal Engineers, just returned from China shortly before the coronavirus actually hit. So we managed to get across there and see what was going on. We interrogated some of the Chinese engineers, which was a bit disconcerting, I think, for them. But what we did find out that actually what they do and how they allocate contract work is because their client base understands the actual cost of materials and the cost of doing works down to a bill of quantities type level, that they can actually adopt a term contract approach. Now, we use that in this country, but it tends to be up for projects that may well come up to about £250,000 worth. But there they can take this to multi-million-pound type allocations. The work is then allocated to known contractors who are judged on their ability to deliver it on time and the quality of work, as well as the health and safety aspects, which are becoming more prevalent in that country. Now, I think it would be fair to say, I'm not naive enough to think that for a minute that the Chinese type of work would actually become acceptable to us here in Western Europe. But I think there's maybe an opportunity for us to actually look for fast-tracking term contracting and to be able to build some certain works that would actually give us some confidence that it's built to a standard and built in time and built to a project cost that may well be of benefit to everybody. And on the benefits to everybody, I think that we've got to be paramount in understanding that, in actual fact, that to be able to do change and to do it quickly, you really do need to have the public with you. If you don't have the public who are keen to see this being done, if you try to fight against public, you tend to be fighting against elected members, and that's where you will find obstructions in the whole process. So,
John, can I bring you to an end there? Because I think you've pointed on an interesting point there. And I'd quite like to get some questions in. So, right. Is that okay, John?
Yeah,
that's great. So I think the elected members' view on this is an interesting one to perhaps touch on from people. If anyone's got any questions, please start typing them in. I guess if I can raise one question to start with for both of you, it would be that, or maybe I'm initially to Robert, and if John wants to chip in, then that would be great too. I mean, Robert, your whole emphasis is on, your organization's whole emphasis is on good quality urban design and raising design standards. What we've heard here is that really the government wants things put in very quickly, and there may not be a lot of money to do so. Are we at risk of really delivering a whole load of cheap and nasty schemes that then sort of wither away or are held in some sort of limbo for months on end? And what's their status? And perhaps people want to come in on that kind of discussion from anyone who's got views. raise your hand or come in on the chat.
Yes, of course. In an ideal world, we would want a real top-notch low traffic neighbourhood, say. But if at a national level, the cost of doing this is going to be probably in the order of 20 billion quid, maybe.
How much? 20
billion.
20 billion?
Yeah, if you did high-end street improvements.
Well, no, okay, we can forget that.
Nothing wrong with that at all. It would benefit the vast majority of the population. These are back-of-the-envelope calculations that all of us should practice, by the way. So you can test me on that one later on, perhaps. But what needs to happen is that the road space is claimed for pedestrians and cyclists and active travel while it's still possible to do it. As time goes on, we will get more people undertaking journeys that are time-based, system-based journeys where they're trying to get somewhere urgently. People will be driving faster, whereas during the lockdown, the type of driving has tended to be quite relaxed. So it doesn't take much for cyclists to be completely intimidated off the road network. The figures suggest that about 60% think roads are too dangerous for cycling. That's a disastrous situation to be in. What we need is these temporary measures to obtain the space for cyclists and pedestrians, and then the improvements can follow on in the years and decades ahead.
Right, okay. Louise Upton, you're a councillor. Hello, Louise.
Hello, yeah, hi, I am.
Tell me your story.
Yes, so I'm a city councillor in Oxford, and we think of ourselves as a cycling city. We are desperate to get a whole raft of measures in. We think we should be at the forefront of this, but we're not the Highways Authority. They sit above us, and they are dragging their heels. So I wonder, what is it? You mentioned there are things we can do, like go to local government ombudsman or judicial review. What do you think is the best way for us to get them to act quickly?
Right, so we've got council on council tensions as well. Okay, that's an interesting one. If anyone's got any comment on that?
If I could make a comment there just quickly.
Yeah.
It may well be an example, just to look at what happened, as was mentioned and reminded to me earlier on in New York, where there was some, New York and Manhattan Island, if you understand, has got very, very high traffic volumes, and any imposition on that traffic demand has been hardly and heavily resisted. However, there was a case made for areas to be made pedestrianised, and basically just shut the roads and just painted the roads blue, and put some chairs and tables out. It didn't look particularly nice, but actually it did work, but it gave an indication immediately to the public what that could look like and how the flow in traffic was impacted. I think that to get some quick moves like this just now, and considering what the councillors just said there, I'm presuming this is parish council against the bigger council.
Yeah, district.
District council.
City county.
City v county.
Ah, right, okay. Slightly different where I've had. Every country's got things slightly differently, but actually, public opinion is the one thing that makes people in power move faster than anything else, which I'm quite sure you'll appreciate. So I would suggest that maybe just getting some streets and say they're parallel with other ones, they're not particularly heavily trafficked, let's turn them into the cycle paths. Possibly we can see how that works out in the long term. It's a quick idea, might work, and if it doesn't, if it's a disaster, it's not the end of the world, and you haven't spent a lot of money in trying to try it out.
Okay, well, David, Robert, you've got support from Councillor David Beeman, who says £20 billion seems cheap to me compared to building HS2. Tony May, you've got a point about York. Just before I introduce you, I was interested in York's example, where I think on Bishopthorpe Road, they have widened the pavement by taking away the cycle lane. So it doesn't always work that you're taking away road space from general vehicles. But over to you, Tony.
Well, that's part of the picture. What they've done is make the road one way for general traffic and put in a contraflow cycle lane, but with no markings, no separation. So cyclists are very worried about it. But my concern was more about the pedestrians, because they've widened the space for pedestrians, because there are a series of shops where everybody's got to queue outside to wait to get in them. But you've got a curb down the middle of the wider pedestrian space, which of course is absolutely no use for wheelchair users and a distinct hazard for blind people. So does anybody have suggestions as to how we can widen pavements at low cost while not having an impediment to movement right down the middle of them? Thanks.
Thank you. Does someone want to come back on that? Does anyone raise their hand or just drop a quick note on chat? I think it's an interesting point. We hopefully will pick up on that from someone, Tony. I'm just nothing instantly, so I'm just going to, if we can come back to that. Now I'm going to pronounce this name wrong. Navdita.
It's fine.
I'll beg your pardon. You've got a question, haven't you? About
I do.
Yeah.
I think what's been quite exciting is, especially when you walk to your local high street. I live in Earlscourt, and there are a lot of places on that street which were always very narrow, and suddenly you had these road barriers which have widened it up. It almost feels like a trace paper exercise and really bad looking barriers, but which have created some really interesting spaces. For the first time ever, I actually saw kids playing behind that barrier on a high street, which is wonderful. How do you actually capture those as legacy in the future so that those barriers don't just come off and those narrow areas don't just go back to being narrow? So any comments on that would be great.
Yeah. Robert, can I just bring you in on that point? Because I think there's a bit of confusion, maybe this is just me, but I suspect other people, about whether this is all about COVID-19 or whether this is about a long-term plan to change cities and COVID-19 being the vehicle for doing so. This guidance is supposed to be reviewed after 3 months, but do you see it as a vehicle for delivering long-term change, or do you think it's just a short-term thing?
Well, the Minister in the introduction says it is looking towards long-term change, and it's statutory guidance. Don't forget, never call this guidance, always call it statutory guidance, okay? That applies to everybody. We must write that down and have it engraved on our, whatever we want to engrave it on. It looks to the long term, and recall what the Minister said in the introduction, it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity.
So how do you respond to Navita's point there about how you go from a temporary scheme, which maybe looks a bit odd and isn't great quality, to a permanent scheme? Because a permanent scheme, you'd presumably have to go through all the statutory processes on.
If it's under experimental orders, then there may not be any need for that. And the processes needn't be onerous. What Mr. Thompson was saying about community support, that is the critical thing. If the community likes the changes that have been introduced, likes the lower traffic, likes the cleaner air, then sooner or later the funds will follow.
Okay. Can Andy Solkill, can you just close your screen down because everyone's watching it? I beg your pardon. That's great. Sorry, that's great. On that point, I'm going to bring Paul Biggs in about consultation, etc., and engagement on these. Paul, can you take yourself off mute?
I have done now. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'm concerned this is like bypassing democracy. Now, we've seen things like TCOs being used. They're not designed for this sort of thing, but transport policy, they're designed for emergency repairs to a road, for example. So there's no consultation involved before or afterwards with those. You should really use experimental traffic orders where after a certain period of time, 18 months, there has to be a consultation. So I'm quite worried that this is being railroaded through, that you're trying to force people to do things they don't want to do. You're trying to force people to cycle. They might not want to. You have to take into account people's personal transport choice in a democracy, and I think this is bypassing it.
That must. I would imagine some people might have views on that. Do anyone want to come in on that? Or are we no comments on that point about engagement in democracy?
Andrew, it's John Dales here.
John, yes.
Oh my word! Oh, that's better. No, I think it's a really good point. It's a general principle, which is there is a sense of urgency, and we need to do stuff now. But I think, especially in terms of moving forward, what we do after that, I think we've got to work out how we do, and this is a real challenge. How do we engage effectively? And it's not just the general issues of democracy and other different users. I wouldn't agree with Paul that people are being forced to do one thing or another, but there are lots of issues out there. For example, quite a few concerns from blind and partially sighted, other types of disabled people with different types of disabilities saying, well, that's great, but this doesn't work for me. Some of these barriers, temporary barriers, I see we're getting this, but now I can't cross the street. There aren't ramps down and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And actually, Robert in his presentation spoke about the Equalities Act, and there is this danger, I think, temptation, and I get that, which is got to do stuff, right? Mm-hmm. But actually, we've still got to try and do stuff as robustly and broadly as we can. And I think the Paul's point about experimental traffic orders, right? Do it now, but actually you can reflect on that formally. I'm not an expert on the orders generally, but that opportunity to think, you know, perhaps, and this comes back to maybe also to Robert's point about sharing experience. To be honest, I don't think we need to. It shouldn't be too much, but basically, you're going to sequester some space temporarily with barriers so that people can walk past queues. It should just be in our thinking, apart from anything else, that we either consult people. We shouldn't need to know that we have to put a ramp in. So I think there is an issue there, and it's probably a question for almost a broader discussion, which is how do we do appropriate consultation and engagement when we have an emergency on. But I just think it's an issue that does need, possibly not right now, but is a consideration. I think really is something we should try and engage us at this time.
Yes, I know I think we've reported in LTT last issue, Freight Transport Association, saying really they don't believe the statutory guidance really addresses freight concerns, and they've written to the minister to find out, get some clarifications on things like loading and unloading arrangements. Yeah.
Well, I mean, everybody will have a point of view, and these are reasonable ones, and it's a very complex world. What the road haulage association was saying this week, that's kind of understandable from their point of view. It's a reasonable point. There's a lot to be considered, and I suppose we've just got to, I think, respect the fact that this is a challenge. We've got to, this is all new, but we've got to work out how we do engage more broadly and effectively.
Okay. I can see, David, you're waving David Harrison from Living Streets, you've got a question, but I'm actually going to let you come in because you've got a point of time to speak later on.
Point. Can I respond to the democracy point?
Okay, quickly. Yeah.
That for many, certainly in the London boroughs and the City of London, most of the reallocation of road space and the creation of low transport neighbourhoods is in fact entirely in line with the recent transport strategy. So all it's doing is encourage them to accelerate policies that have already been publicly agreed. So
okay, thank you. Just when you come back on, David, it's quite hard to hear you, so I don't know if there's something with your mic. Vicky, can I go to Vicky Welchman? You've got some experience from Bristol where you're saying that you did something quite quick, and tell us more.
No, I'm just saying that from the local authority perspective, you know, as the guy just said, a lot of these things are in transport plans, but for all the reasons that you gave, that big long list, there are often reasons why it's difficult. And this experience now is, you know, a national emergency, which is giving the opportunity to show how different things can be. And actually, people find it hard to envisage if they don't see it on the ground, but they might think they like it. And so, you know, it is an opportunity for a big experiment and to move things forward in a much quicker way than we would have done normally.
Interesting. Okay. Richard Walker, over to you, Richard.
Hi. Yeah, I just mentioned that we've actually got two emergencies going on at the moment. There's the COVID emergency, and there's the equally important, in fact, more devastating climate emergency. So it's over 35 degrees in the Siberian Arctic at the moment. Most local authorities in England have declared a climate emergency and have to meet trajectories to reduce their carbon emissions of about 7 or 8% per year. In fact, that some local authorities have got about 8 years worth of carbon emissions at 2019 levels left before they run out of their carbon budget altogether. So we, you know, acting rapidly and and what we might call boldly is exactly what's required at the moment for both emergencies. Because the COVID emergency is real, particularly with the problem of using public transport. We can't have everybody driving into towns. There just won't be possible to accommodate that on the road network. So we're going to have to make the roads safe for cycling on. Anyway, the reason I wanted to come in was to say that Decarbonate at Leeds, which is I'm seconded to at the moment, we've put up 3. This is for registered research institutions in England or possibly in UK. There's 21,000, which is 3 grants of 7,000 for evaluation studies of these rapid response measures. So if anybody wants any information on that, they could email me or my colleague Shona McCulloch, or just contact me in the margin, and I'll get the details out to you. It's a very, very quick study, but the idea is that we'll be able to answer some of these questions that have been posed about what the kind of negative side effects of these urgent measures actually is by doing a proper evaluation of them, but doing it rapidly.
Really interesting.
Okay, thank you.
See how nice and
Thank you
sunny it
for that.
is? It's supposed to rain later today.
Right, going back up the chat, one point that's of interest here is Daniel Simpson of Landor, a colleague. Daniel, are you there?
Yeah, hi, I'm here.
I just want to make your point because I think it's an interesting one.
DFT just fast-tracked a consultation on electric scooters, and I think it's not a case of if they will be made legal on UK roads, English roads. It's just a matter of time before we see them introduced. I'm just interested to hear if any councils and in fact, Richard Smith did come back to me to say West Midlands are now engaging with some operators, and there may be some procurement exercise involved in bringing them in. But yeah, it's just to see from a kind of highways engineering and planning point of view, what are councils doing right now to plan for their introduction to roads.
That's a good point. Can I just invite John and go back to John and Robert on that point about electric scooters? Do you have any? Are you relaxed about the idea of these appearing on the road network?
Yeah, I'll come back in here with that one. Relaxed is not a word I would use. I've seen them around the world used quite a lot now. Britain seems to be the one place that's actually dragging its heels as far as that's concerned. The one thing that does strike me is, though, that where I've seen them, they tend to be used in dedicated lanes, and the quality of the road surface is far better than the quality of the road surfaces we enjoy in this country. We've gone through at least 10 years of austerity. You've already talked about local authorities nigh on bankrupt. Some of them are probably bankrupt, they're just not being called that. The roads maintenance budgets are non-existent. We've got temporary repairs that are going on to it. None of that is actually going to make it better. Relaxed is not a word I would use. I think that there has got to be careful and due consideration of how you and where you introduce these rapid pieces of machinery.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Well,
Just
Robert,
another point on that. I mean, sorry, Andrew.
Daniel, yeah, sure.
Yeah,
sure.
I mean, we're talking about fast-moving machinery. I mean, I would much rather share any road space with an electric scooter than a vehicle, a car, for example. So I think from a safety point of view, they are much safer than most powered vehicles that are on our roads.
It's John, you're referring to the danger of the users, aren't you, going into potholes?
Yeah. Primarily it's that. Yeah, they are. I mean, the scooters will go at 16 miles an hour. And as I said before, I saw them in Virginia last year, where they were actually competing with cars running away from traffic lights. Now, it's just bad practice, but people are people, and they do these sorts of things. There's a very, very small wheel. The slightest deformation in the road surface will throw people off them. You're right in isolation. using them on their own are great. No great problem with that whatsoever. It's when they mix with other types of transport, like vehicles, certainly heavy vehicles. Actually, pedestrians is not a great idea having these things going fast either.
Okay. Look, it's come to 3 o'clock, and I did have a private message from Peter saying that I should take this session to 3 because it was there was quite a lot of substance to go over in that, and I think both presentations were really, really excellent. So I'm going to now, I'm going to hand over to Robert to take forward the session now, which is really about case study work. Just before I do so, Peter was just saying, is there a message from this part of the session for the DFT? I'm afraid my brain is not fully distilling all the interesting things I've heard. All I would say is the DFT should have been here to listen in, because it was a really enjoyable session. So over to you, Robert.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Andrew. May I kick off straight away by inviting Mark Frost, Assistant Director Transport, Parking and Environmental Strategy at the London Borough of Hounslow, to share his screen and start us off on this second session, where we're really getting down to the nitty-gritty.
Hopefully you can hear me and you can see a screen. Yeah. I check people can see the screen, yeah?
Brilliant, thank you.
Yeah, very good. All right, very quickly then. So essentially this is a very quick whistle-stop tour for what Hounslow is doing as a London borough on this agenda. In a sense, we're trying to comply with the long list that Robert gave, that was the instruction from central government. So we're doing all those things and more. I'm going to run through some examples of that and maybe some things where we're doing which might be of interest to colleagues, slightly innovative possibly. We're putting out a lot of cones. We haven't used all 2 million of them yet, but we're starting to get through them. These are a number of shopping arcades where you've clearly got very narrow footways. We're putting out a lot of cones and suspending parking bays. That was our immediate response, and that was particularly at places where there was queuing. I would say, though, that there is very little consensus on this stuff. In the bubble, there's a feeling that this is a fairly timid reaction. In the real world, there's howls of anger about this sort of thing, and it becomes very time-consuming and tiring to keep fighting that stuff, which is not a reason not to do it, but it is a reason, an example of why there is an issue with pace. And I do think that there's a number of people have said if you don't bring the community along with you, it does become quite difficult. So there's a real balance there, and I think that that's a real challenge for the profession. Another response was that we had a number of schemes that we were working on that we paused, like most authorities, at the end of March, early April. Happened to be a number of cycle schemes and footway widening schemes and road closure schemes, and we were able to bring back a number of those quite rapidly from early May. And that was the council putting its own funding on the line to get those started again, because all of our funding from central government has dried up, and from TfL. So we're expected to do more than we've ever done in shorter time frame, but with less money than we've ever had. This also included a number of schemes where we were looking to improve access to hospitals, and that was an area where there seemed to be genuine consensus that we needed to act quickly at that time, although it's a fast-moving beast. We then started looking at all of the conversations we were having with the community about where we wanted to do this sort of stuff. Fairly progressive local authority, I guess, so we've been talking to people at some length about that. This is an area in Chiswick Island, South Chiswick, and we are about to go out to consultation. Well, no. We're about to engage people on proposals to introduce experimental traffic orders at 10 locations. And just to give you a quick flavour of what some of these are. Some of these are hard closures. So number 3, for example, is a hard closure here, restricting access onto what is the A4. Number 2 is a no access, only accept access route that is going to be enforced by 2 linked ANPR cameras. So if you go past first number 2 and then you trigger out the second number 2 within a specific time, that would be a contravention. So you get rid of all the through traffic, but you retain access to the roads for businesses and to residents. Number 5 is essentially a hard closure except for residents. So residents can register their vehicles with us. They can go through that closure, but nobody else can. And that gets rid of a very significant northbound rat run. And there's a range of other school streets and other sort of proposals in there, but there's a fairly innovative use of ANPR technology, trying to do some of the hard closure stuff in a way that's a little bit more friendly for residents and therefore may be more likely to stay for a longer period. We're doing a number of school streets. There's an example of a school street that we put in relatively recently. So nobody's allowed to drive into that cul-de-sac unless they're registered with us, otherwise they get a fine, £130. And in addition, we've also put red route controls on. So this is the first borough outside of TfL to use red route controls in our network. And that obviously allows us to find people using CCTV, and that's parents that are setting down and picking up their children as well. And that's quite a strong combination. We are, like most authorities, we're doing some sort of consultation to try and gather ideas. This is our attempt to do as much engagement as we can while still moving at pace. And actually, it's not been too bad. We've had a few hundred people comment on stuff, and not just the bubble, although maybe mainly the bubble, and well over 1,000 either specific points or agreements on those points. And lots of people giving us lots of comments, all of which we are able to react to in some way, and at some amount of pace as well. We're also thinking about our wider policy response, and we're really focusing on parking, because that does feel like that's something which we can do something on. We were hoping that we were going to be the second authority to have a workplace parking levy. I think we still will be, but we won't be quite as quick as we were hoping to be. We put this back a year. We're hoping to get it in next year, looking like it will probably be the year after. And we're looking to recast this as a way of a policy tool to reduce that car use going into some of those major employment sites. But instead of looking at it solely as a way of funding a new public transport link, in this case it was a link to Crossrail, we're looking at it as a way of reducing car use, but also funding walking and cycling improvements in that area. So it's a slight recast as a consequence of the situation. And we're also looking at a whole bunch of other parking restrictions. We kind of put these on pause as soon as the pandemic started, but we're bringing those back, including emission-based parking charges, looking potentially at not allowing any high emission vehicles to gain access to on-street permits from a time a few years in the future. And so this is a way to sort of capitalise with people to say, we do need to change, and that means you, and we're going to use the sticks and powers that we have to push people towards that change, whilst having due regard to the equalities duty. So we're looking at some innovative stuff around means testing some permits, for example. And obviously doing quite a lot of soft stuff, including cycle training. I think we're the first borough to restart one-to-one cycle training in London, and working with the NHS to provide bikes, and soon to teachers as well, through a partnership with Brompton. And that's it.
Just unmuting myself there. Thank you very much, Mark. It's good to see that the practical, and you can see the complexity of the things that need to be done to get these measures in place. Can we ask then Andy Sulkeld, Cycling and Walking Leicester City Council, if you're around, can you share your desktop, please? Thank you.
Andy, can you come off mute, please?
While Andy's trying to get his sound sorted, Tom Cohen asked a question on hard closures except for residents. How were these going to be enforced? Can we put that to Mark, please?
Yes, absolutely. So we use the same technique that we used to enforce the school streets. So in school streets, residents and their visitors can still go in and out through the closure. They had to register their number plate with us. If that number plate goes on a white list, and then the camera knows that that person's on the list and is allowed to go in. If your number plate's not on the white list, you get a PCN.
And how much roughly?
Can you hear me now?
How much does an AMPR camera cost? How would one of those go?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and it's something that we're really delving into. It appears that there's vast discrepancies in these costs depending on what system that you have. The typical system would be £20,000 to £25,000, including all the back office required to set it up. However, we think possibly there might be a solution that may be a bit cheaper, so we're exploring that.
Peter Jones has asked, what about delivery drivers dropping off parcels? How would that be?
So for the restriction, which is 2 ANPR cameras linked together, there is essentially a speed or a time between those 2 cameras. So if somebody went into that zone and dropped off a parcel and then went out in the way that you weren't supposed to, then you wouldn't trigger that contravention because it would be beyond the, it would be longer than the minimum time. For the hard closures, where you have these resident dispensations, we can have some technology which doesn't enforce for, say, HGVs and LGVs, or alternatively, actually in this example that I put up there, the delivery drivers can still get in a different way. So all we're saying is that residents, we're going to try and make it as easy as possible for you, but anybody else who's coming to access your site will essentially be making a hard road close.
Thank you very much. That's an excellent answer. Very helpful. Is Andy with us yet? Hello, Andy. What I'm going to suggest is if we could skip over Andy just temporarily while you get...
Can you hear me now?
Are you there?
Can you hear me now?
Ah, yes, we can hear you.
Brilliant, superb. Can you see the screen okay? Apologies for that. Okay, I'll just run you quickly through the work that we've been carrying out in Leicester to reallocate road space as a response to the COVID crisis. You may have seen this image of Craig, one of our highways team operatives, closing the first part of the key worker corridor, which was about 10 days ago or 15 days ago here in Leicester, which we've subsequently extended. It's important to say that the work that we're currently doing is part of the Connecting Leicester project, but more recently it forms part of a kind of holistic delivery around walking and cycling support for key workers, which has involved bike loans, bike fixing, pedestrian support, public transport support where that's feasible, and we've had an overwhelming response from workers within 90% of whom are NHS and care workers who work in the local hospitals and health centres. So there is a specific response in what we're doing intrinsically in the immediacy around the needs for people within the crisis to get to work to help the rest of us. So just in response to the question about whether this is democratic or anti-democratic, the first rule, or that should be the first rule of government, is to protect citizens and to act and not to dither. One of the what we've got in front of us in this plan is just a summary of the work which was recently announced, or yesterday was announced by the City Mayor's team, to take forward steps in Leicester in response to the government's direction 10 days ago. We've been carrying out immediate short-term feasibility studies and bringing forward a project and a plan to respond to the road space reallocation needs, to make sure essential workers can get to work. The context in Leicester is that 40% of households and 66% of people do not have access to a car. So it would be remiss of us at a time like this to not respond to their needs. Just to describe the plan in detail, or well, some plan in sketch. The orange locations are retail shopping streets and some key projects which we'll be taking forward. The red are also kind of secondary shopping streets where we'll be reallocating road space, much in the way that colleagues from Hounslow have been describing, taking out, suspending parking, letting that space be used and utilised by people who are queuing for their essential goods and services. The green routes are corridor schemes where we're reallocating space primarily to cyclists, and in some cases from buses because the number of bus passengers has collapsed significantly within the city. We can still maintain access to the bus stops, and we can still maintain the support for public transport, but we don't need the headway gain that the bus lanes give. So we're giving over some of those spaces in the short term with the use of cones to cyclists. The yellow routes are that you can see are some of the locations in the city where we've had substandard cycle lanes on street for a serious period of time, decades. Although we've not found the resources to basically make them protected up until this point, we're taking steps now, like Hounslow again and other local authorities. We've purchased wands as well as cones, and we'll be rolling out a programme of improvements in terms of light segregation in those facilities over the next 10 weeks. And we'll move on to the final slide. Yeah, just to say where we are. This is an example of one of the schemes. I was out on London Road in Leicester yesterday. It starts with a substandard cycle lane. We've made a marginal improvement to it. It's still substandard, but it is a pop-up scheme, and we're affording protection in the immediacy. This is a project that took 5 hours to implement along a 1.2 mile corridor. We're going to continue in terms of the next steps. We're going to continue the Leicester Bikeaid project and unlimit the limited supply of bikes that we've been able to make available to workers. It is an extension of the Connecting Leicester project. We are continuing with our Transforming Cities project and rolling out road space reallocation and extended pedestrianisation within the city. We're formulating a recovery plan, and the transport elements of it sit alongside all manner of kind of service responses to the recovery plans of the City Council. We're committing to a mile a week, but it's more likely to be 2 miles a week by the time we get through the 10-week programme, by reorientating the resources that we've currently got within the city and bringing in where we can afford it, and where they're not bought out by other local authorities, where we're bringing in organisations that can introduce some of that protection for us, particularly in terms of wands and temporary curbs, which will become permanent. And the Deputy City Mayor went on record yesterday saying it'll be very difficult to take these things out once we've got them in, if they prove to be popular. So it was very much a kind of a pushback on some of the critics who were saying, yeah, it's great, all right, putting them in on a temporary basis, but where's the long-term solution? We're planning for a long-term solution, but we're getting on with the crisis now and not resting on our laurels like a lot of local authorities are trying to do across the city, and that's really commendable. These are key worker corridors, and we've identified that very clearly up front. This is about protecting and providing and enhancing the essential services that are keeping all of us safe at the current time. We are introducing wider footways in the shopping streets primarily, and we're introducing the cycle tracks on the arterial routes where they were either planned under the Connecting Leicester project. We had some of them already on street going forward, or where we've taken the opportunity to say, look, there's a propensity and a need along these particular corridors where we have 2 lanes or 3 lanes. We're able to reduce those somewhat and reallocate that road space. And then the final part of our resilience planning is in 2 months' time, 8 to 10 weeks' time, we'll be going live with a bike share project. And in the first instance, during the testing period, that will be on offer for free to essential workers to make sure that they can utilise the bikes to get about their business in those locations and across those geographies where it's suitable for them, and then we can reallocate kind of the bikes that we've given them in the first instance to people who perhaps can't be serviced by the bike share project. That's a very fly-through summary of what we're doing. We're all very busy at the moment, but really appreciate this opportunity to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Striking there again, as in the case of Hounslow, you've got an underlying strategy that you're accelerating. I'm going to invite the next speaker, David Harrison, to speak, but while David is talking, would you be able to work out roughly how much a pop-up cycle lane costs per kilometre? Do you think?
Yeah. Well, if you're doing them with corns, we can work it out. It's really easy. It's about £15 a corn.
Don't tell us now.
Intervals. I'll work it out for you.
Come back. That's great, because we can look up. There are 4,500 kilometres of urban B road. There's 9,500 kilometres of urban A road. So we can work out the a national cost, if you like. Anyway, now Dr. David Harrison. Now I've got to share the slides, and if you bear with me one moment. Nope, that hasn't worked. Let's have another go. Here we go. Dr. David Harrison, London Living Streets.
Can we go to the next slide, Robert? Sorry, I've got too many. So this point seems obvious on this slide, but it's worth stressing the point that the sheer scale of London, 8 million people, the fact that in inner London, parts of inner London, the walking mode share is already large at 40%. In Islington, only 70% of households don't have access to a car, 60% in many other London boroughs. And the huge use of public transport, which people won't be using on the same scale now, means that walking and cycling is going to be incredibly important. It's hard to stress as people return to work and return, to going to the workplace rather than home working, return to school. The scale of walking and cycling in London will be absolutely phenomenal. Can we go to the next slide, please? The actions being taken are obviously determined at 3 levels in London: by government, by the mayor, and by the boroughs. The government is really interested in active travel, and it's what rather marvellous coincidence that the Mayor Boris's former transport advisor in London, Andrew Gilligan, who forced through the cycle routes and the Mini Holland programme in Waltham Forest, is now the key advisor in number 10. And clearly is, I suspect, a driving force behind the government's proactive travel. On the mayor has produced his own streetscape plan. What we've seen are pop-up cycle lanes on Park Lane, pavement widening in Dalston. There are teething problems with the ones that TfL have introduced. There are continuous barriers, which means they're not permeable. On Park Lane, there's difficulty in actually getting to the cycle lane where it begins, and the impermeability, say, on Kingston High Street, has created problems in crossings. Crossings, we're hoping to see automatic green men for pedestrians so that you don't have to press the button, and we need much wider crossings and a huge removal of guard railings, etc., to allow social distancing and not bunching when people cross. And this will be a terrific challenge at the mainline station, that's like King's Cross and Euston. The mayor has also suggested parts of London will be car-free, which I'll detail later. And great of all is, the great thing is that he is asking boroughs to come forward with low traffic neighbourhoods. Next slide, please, Robert. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Right. So the boroughs are taking a range of actions, some of which Mark have described: road closures, Hackney's closed Broadway Market, really so shopping street, but also used for through traffic. Tower Hamlets has closed a busy road at Old Ford Road, pavement widening all over the place, parking removal, for example, in Waltham Forest. But most of all, and I think most important from our point of view, is boroughs are accelerating their programme of low traffic neighbourhoods, which Robert has already described and Mark has described. There are a series of getting through traffic out of residential streets so that people can play in them, enjoy them, etc. I'll say more later. The funding, we think, the rumour is that each London borough, but Mark can correct me, that the whole immediate budget available to London boroughs is somewhere between 40 and 50 million, which they'll be bidding for. The general advice is to use experimental orders because they don't need formal consultation and they can become permanent. There are problems. I think particular problems may exist at a high level amongst officers in boroughs. So the transport people are often fine. The politicians are often quite keen to get on with it, depending on the borough. But I think there is finding to be some frustration with both the very senior officers in the borough worrying about revenues, being cautious, and also in some places with the highway engineers who have a traditional way of doing things. For example, in Islington, street cutter has been added to only recently with no new poles. The Royal Parks are also involved, and they've done some great work, except in Regent's Park, where the Crown Estates Paving Commission is involved. Can you carry on, Robert? Next slide, please. Can we have the next slide? Well, so the Royal Parks have removed traffic, motor traffic from many of them, like Richmond. Here we are. So we think the low traffic neighbourhoods are transformational. They've been a tremendous success in Waltham Forest, leading to people enjoying the streets more, walking 30 minutes more a week, and they're been included in many inner London borough transport strategies, and no doubt outer London ones too. So in a sense, as I said earlier, what's happening is we're now boroughs are accelerating programmes that they wanted to put in together. They're going to be done much more cheaply, but that's not necessarily a great problem. Sometimes they may even be better for not being over-engineered. We saw an experimental scheme at Bank Junction where that was closed to all traffic except buses recently, and just the very fact of removing traffic turned it into a really very beautiful space. So I hope we can see play coming back to streets. As you'll see in the slide of the mobility scooter, this is in de Beauvoir, Hackney, one that exists already. These can be great places for people with mobility problems. And most of all, this is what I worry about, is that boroughs need to see the links between these local traffic neighbourhoods, connecting routes that allow us to create great walking corridors that aren't along the main roads. Next, please, Robert. Oh, and just to say on the low traffic neighbourhood, it has been suggested that they can be done as cheaply as £100,000. So that may be a little too low, but it gives you an idea of just how many you could do. Central London, a few facts here, is 1 million people were travelling into work there. And I think a lot of these journeys might once again be made on foot. There is a wonderful report by the Select Committee on Metropolitan Improvements of 1854, which I would recommend to you, which show that 200,000 people walked into central London daily in those days. I think we might see a return to that. The great estates are looking to, this is the Grosvenors, the Shaftesburys, the Capcos, the Portmans, the Crown Estates, are really eager to see a transformation of London. They need it because for social distancing, they need to get the traffic out of the roads so that people can walk along them, so that there can be pavement cafes. If we're going to reopen the economy, traffic has to be ended. Each borough has a different position. So the City of London and Camden have traditionally been much more ambitious. Westminster tends to be cautious. They have powerful residents who want to drive their cars. and the response has so far been a little equivocal, and it's not clear when they say they'd like to do things, but they want to balance interests, whether they have to say that and intend to do a lot, or whether they don't. Next slide, please, Robert. So in London, some really wonderful, central London, some wonderful things are happening. Road closures at London Bridge and Waterloo, the removal of through traffic is expected from whole corridors. Definitely, I think, from Old Street to Holborn along Clerkenwell Road. I'm hoping very much it will happen from London Bridge to Shoreditch along that route, of course, of which huge numbers of people go across from Liverpool Street to the Eastern Corridor. The road closures the city has already announced in Lombard Street, in Old Broad Street to allow people to get from Liverpool Street to Bank. And we're seeing low traffic neighbourhoods being planned in most of London and possibly in Camden, in Covent Garden, Bloomsbury are being proposed. And these walking corridors. If I can go to the next slide, please, Robert. So can we have the next slide?
You've got the next slide. It'll take.
Oh, right. Isn't there one more?
There's a map of the walking corridors, yes, the Central London Walking Network.
Could we have that?
That's on display. Do you want the one after that?
Yes, please. This is fine. So people will need places to walk, and London Living Streets. This is a plug for our plot. Our plans has created a network in accompaniment with other stakeholders and with the London boroughs to create a network of walking routes that will allow people to get to key destinations whilst leaving some of the other streets for general traffic. We very much see this as being a great help for developing the plans as they go forward, as central London becomes even more of a walking city. Thank you. Thanks, Robert.
Right. Thank you very much, David. And good to know what's going on in London, and a bit of insight as to the internal management and political issues in certain of the London boroughs. Last on our list is Ruby Stringer, Senior Consultant of ITP. So may I invite you to share your screen and take you through your presentation. There we go.
Just bear with me 1 second.
Okay. I see somebody's made an observation about John Major's Cones hotline.
Can you see my screen?
We can see it.
Fantastic. Okay, so I'm hoping I don't just repeat everything that everyone else has already said, but perhaps it's kind of useful to have a bit of a kind of wrap up at this point in the discussion. I don't know, hopefully that's the case. So the way I was kind of coming at this, so I was asked to talk about some work we've been doing with Camden recently, but I kind of wanted to also talk around the kind of wider opportunities and challenges that are presented by the kind of COVID situation. So briefly, I think we've kind of gone through most of these. So obviously we've got a danger of kind of rising car use and all the kind of bad things that go along with that. So congestion, emissions, road safety concerns. We've got, as part of this, there's likely to be an increase in single occupancy car use. And it kind of threatens to undo all of our, as an industry, all of our hard work, moving people onto public transport. And the falling kind of public transport patronage is really unlikely to recover very quickly, I think. Along with the car use issue, we've got safety concerns, both from kind of high speeds and increasing volumes as lockdown begins to lift and people are unable to use public transport, but also kind of the obvious COVID related safety concerns, providing enough space for everyone to socially distance, moving as many people as possible away from public transport so that people who have no choice but to use public transport are able to socially distance from each other. But I think it's really important to kind of bear in mind that there's a lot of opportunities here as well. And I think we shouldn't shy away too much from seeing it as what it is, which is that a lot of this is what we've kind of been fighting for all along, kind of the idea that cycling heals a whole lot of problems all in one go. It has a public health impact. It reduces emissions. It helps to, we've already spoken about the climate emergency, and it really helps with trying to tackle that. It improves safety. It's a really equal way of trying to improve access to transport, because most or many people can cycle it, whether that's through adapted cycles or regular normal push bikes, and kind of as opposed to car use, it's a much more kind of level playing field of transport. But there are lots of unknowns, which makes it really challenging, because obviously we've already spoken about, we don't really have the time for necessarily going slow and feeling it all out and figuring out what the best thing to be done is, because we need to move quickly. And also it's really difficult to respond to everything that's going on. So for example, in London, we've had a lot of announcements recently of TfL's emergency networks and road closures and funding changes and everything else, but none of that is easy to predict. So we're just having to react to it as it comes. And the key point that I suppose I wanted to emphasize is that I think because this does feed into a lot of the things that as an industry we've been arguing for quite a long time, we as much as possible should kind of feel excited about being able to do the best we can. But what I wanted to focus on here is how we make sure we do get the most positive impact we can do. And I think for me there are two specific ways or two specific aspects to how we do that. So the first one is speed. We've got to be doing it really quickly. We've got to be doing it right now. As Robert, you've already spoken about with the statutory guidance and everything, it's got to be done kind of as soon as possible to help with essential journeys, and in order to have significant impact on behaviour change, so changing the way that people travel, we've got to have all of these cycle lanes, walking lanes in place before the lockdown is fully lifted and people start returning to work, because once people move to single occupancy car use, it's going to be much harder to move them back out of it. Obviously, we know lots of cities and boroughs and local authorities are already moving ahead with this. And of course, it is a really big challenge to try and do it without a lead in time. And it does risk attracting challenges from people in terms of consultation and notification periods and everything. But we've got to do the best with what we've got, I suppose. And the other point I wanted to touch on is kind of integration. So I think this is always the case. The network has got to be functional. And in order to be functional, it's got to be joined up to all the things we need it to do. So we need it to join up the locations that people need to get to, which is at the moment is NHS sites for key workers. It's mirroring public transport networks, including tube lines in London or bus routes or train lines, so that not only is it possible for people to visualize the journeys that they were making and kind of convert those into cycle journeys, but also to make sure we're kind of linking the locations that they normally would be getting to. And as well as that, it needs to be linked up with the other aspects of the cycle network. So infrastructure for kind of complete journeys. We need to be thinking about cycle parking. We need to be thinking about cycle hire, whether that's dockless bikes or kind of docked bike schemes, and also things like e-scooters and everything are going to completely change that whole landscape. So to kind of move on to what we've actually been doing, so we're still working on a lot of it, so there isn't much in terms of specifics that I'm able to share, but what we were already commissioned to support Camden in prioritising or reprioritising their network that was originally planned for delivery by 2041 and reprioritising it for 2030. In light of the COVID situation, what we've been asked to do is to prioritise the kind of most important links in the network to be delivered as quickly as possible as a pop-up network of segregated cycle routes. And so the original kind of remit of the project was related to the borough's climate emergency, and obviously now it's that plus COVID is the kind of justification for it. And so we've been doing a kind of a small prioritization task on the network. So we've been trying to prioritize the links which link to the existing network, which link to NHS sites, and which map to current and future demand. And we've also, in separate projects, but also with Camden, we've been looking at how the location of doctors' bike hire bays and e-scooters can support the network in that sense. Which again, they were both projects that we were already looking at with Camden, and we've been able to divert from an original purpose, and now it's kind of being driven forward by COVID. And obviously everything is rapidly changing. The funding, what networks there are to plug into, what TfL and the government are prioritising, and the kind of having to do it all really quickly. And for local authorities, I know it's been a struggle to get enough capacity to be able to put in all the bids and get all this work done as quickly as possible. And that's something that, as a kind of small consultancy, we've been able to help Camden out with as well. So I wanted to talk really quickly, because I think a lot of these things we haven't necessarily spoken about. We've spoken a bit about loading and parking, but I think one of the things that we do as a company, and we've done a lot across the UK, is behaviour change initiatives. And so we kind of know, I don't know how well known it is, but people are much more likely to change their habits during a period of change. For most people, this period of time will be the greatest change in their lives, and not taking advantage of that by ensuring that we have everything in place to kind of create this mode shift as dramatically as we can would be a real waste. I think we kind of think so. And it's something that I think local authorities almost don't have the brain space for at the moment, because there's so much going on, and kind of getting the infrastructure in is the focus. But I think trying to do these kind of more traditionally softer measures of behaviour change and communicating what the new infrastructure is and where it's going to be, and how people can use it, and how long it will take to get to key destinations and everything, all of that is really something we need to grab hold of and kind of do as much as possible, and requires a lot of creative thinking, because obviously the way that that's normally done, talking to people in real life and personalised travel planning, isn't currently possible and won't be for the foreseeable. So yeah, we need to be thinking about that as well. And then finally, in terms of kind of unintended consequences and mitigating impacts, we've already spoken quite a lot about the potential equality impacts of throwing stuff in without proper consultation and everything, and I think that's kind of been covered. But we also obviously need to be thinking about freight, we need to be thinking about taxi access for things like that. We need to be thinking about how we can use parking controls to make sure that people aren't using, for example, businesses aren't kind of mass hiring cars or private hire vehicles or whatever to get their employees to work. We need to be thinking broader about what could be happening and trying to kind of intercept that before it occurs almost. So there's a lot to think about. I haven't obviously got all of the answers. I think my kind of central point is that in order to have the intended level of positive impact, we can't just chuck in a load of cycle lanes. I think we've really got to be thinking about how that integrates with, firstly, how people use them, and secondly, kind of how we get more people to use them. So I'll leave it there. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Ruby. And now we come on to the discussion session. So people have been putting in a few questions in the chat. Quite a lot of them about the Cones hotline. Unfortunately, there's a lack of sobriety in the well, it is in the afternoon and it's a Friday, isn't it? So we will gloss over the Cones hotline if that's okay. Two people have asked how councils should best exchange best practice, and would any of the our panel like to answer that? And that includes Mr. Thompson. Anybody?
Happy to say something from London. So
yes.
Yeah, so there's a very active discussion forum across London that's coordinated by the London Technical Advisors Group, part of the LTT organisation, and yeah, so there's lots of sharing going on there. However, I mean, it's clearly lots of wheels being reinvented all over the place, and there's definitely a space, I think, as Robert, as you said at the beginning of this, for some national guidance, an emergency manual for streets, some technical, certainly some very specific technical stuff to come in, so that we're not all going off and working out how to do bus stop borders all at the same time. So yeah, I mean, I think that's a very valid question, and there's a real gap there in the market for proper coordination. And I have to say, probably not enough coordination going on between London and other parts of the country, and vice versa. Learned a lot from that Leicester presentation, for example.
And Andy, would you able to comment from the Leicester perspective?
Yeah, well, joining forums like this, sharing what you're doing through social media publicly are absolutely invaluable, because the speed of change and the speed of the demand and the decision making it's live effectively. There are a whole host of kind of webinars, and we particularly like Ideas with Beers, which Brian Deegan leads and coordinates on, and we're working with Brian. Next week we'll be introducing or presenting a Leicester street design guideline, which the City Mayor will be launching, an element of which, as you wouldn't be surprised to hear, covers kind of temporary and pop-up facilities, and kind of reiterates kind of obligations and opportunities within local authorities like our own, both for long-term developments and short-term opportunism, which is what a lot of us rely on in austere times. But yeah, I think being evidence-based and talking with networks of colleagues, which from my experience, they're very active locally. We've got, we have regular weekly meetings with colleagues in other East Midlands cities or Midland cities. We have regular stakeholder meetings. We've moved them from monthly to weekly as a result of the crisis, because the support that we need from the organisations that are supporting the city council's led objective, but is not owned by the city council. It's a shared, shared objectives in seeing the changes to COVID-19 crisis and the climate change crisis. They're pretty shared, and talking about it and getting on with the job and demonstrating change is the most important thing at the current time, I would say.
So we've got LOTAG working as a network. Is the Technical Advisors Group at a national level working? And I'll bring in John Thompson in just a moment. Does anybody know? The ADEP, the Association of Directors of Environment, Planning and Transport.
Certainly, LGTAG has got a number of regional groups, and I understand that they've all been sharing some best practice and helping. I mean, I do think that we're at a point of transition here, because for the first few weeks, and I speak certainly for myself, we all went into a bunker and to try and survive the onslaught of it all, both the immediate tactical response to all of this, and now this sort of flurry of requirements and requests that we really struggle to keep up with. But I think now we are emerging out of that space, and we are looking for more collaboration. So I think you'll see some more efforts from organisations like ADEPT and CIHT and LGTAG to come bring best practice forward. Unless, of course, the department says that they're going to step in and do that for us, which doesn't seem likely.
Mr. Thompson.
Thanks, Robert. I think when it comes to collaboration, I think maybe I'm going to blow my own trumpet here a little bit by talking about the National Roads Development Guide in Scotland. It did actually combine all 32 councils in Scotland, which was a skill in itself to actually bring that together. But what it's done is it's actually identified all things that are actually in common with everybody, which was actually the vast majority. The variations that were identified from each local authority are clearly identified, and they're managed separately, but they're within the whole web-based process. Can I suggest that basically if someone was to approach Scots, because I'm no longer actually the authority that can actually devolve this now, it is a template that's already there, it's web-based, it just needs some sort of copying and editing. is very much in line with, I imagine, very much of what local English authorities and particularly London authorities are trying to deliver. It's maybe something that can be considered. I think there's one further point I would like to make when it comes to sharing things, and it's based out of work that I did today and yesterday. We're fairly confident that the high proportion of people who can work from home will actually continue to work from home. I mean, the BBC survey is suggesting that working adults are 44% working from home. Now, that's going to have a major impact on reducing traffic levels within roads. I suspect it's probably going to get even higher than that as time carries on. So maybe some of the actual traffic volumes, we've estimated roughly 20% reduction in traffic volumes from now on. This is probably one of the best opportunities that we're going to have from this crisis. So being able to join things up maybe gives you a little bit more time to actually pull this together. As I said, the guide took 4 years to put together. The template's been done, the ideas have been done. I'm quite sure that a focused group, if they got together, could actually pull that together in a year. How was that?
Right, a year. Well, we may have 10 days. So
you've got to work quick, Robert, that's all.
You've got to work quick. It would be good to have this discussion proceeding in a direction. So could we propose a motion? I don't know whether we can do this by voting or somehow extending hands or whatever, that maybe we write to the Department for Transport asking them to set up a network to coordinate best practice amongst local authorities and copy in whoever we think, which could be low tag, adept, LG tag, etc. How would people feel about that?
Can I say something quickly? That I, as the organizer of the web event today, I'm hoping very much that we will get a message like that out of this. We're going to do a write-up, obviously, but Robert, I think you're the whipper-in for this project, and I said earlier we were inviting you to put that kind of open letter to the department on behalf of today's audience in the magazine next week, if you're happy to do it.
Is everybody happy that that should be done? That a mechanism, oh, there's a thumbs up. A mechanism established through the Department for Transport, at least the Department for Transport should pay for it or enable it, working through all of the professional officers associations, etc. So it's a sort of emergency response. Everybody happy? Any dissenters? Motion probably carried. I don't know. Okay. So we've mentioned home working, and I think Mr. Elphick mentioned home working as to whether this would stick in the long term. We have the situation that the majority of personal travel is not about the journey to and from work, but it is other purposes, retail, personal business, leisure, etc. Are we setting too much store by this hope that the journeys will decrease owing to home working? Any thoughts, anybody?
Yeah, I think that's obviously an interesting challenge, Robert. So once again, LowTag and LEDNet are working with the Centre for London to do some slightly more in-depth polling with both a representative sample of residents, but also with businesses and with other business groups about what the reality of that response will be and how that might vary on a sector-by-sector basis. I mean, clearly there are some sectors where it could be done fairly easily, there's others where it can't, and that will have a spatial distribution and an impact on different parts of London in different ways. So I don't have the answers other than the fact it's clearly very important. I was taken by one report that said that apparently the amount of people that are looking at houses in the Banker Belts and in their home counties has shot up by hundreds and hundreds of %. So lots of people thinking about deserting London and moving to the home county. So presumably they're doing so on the basis they can work from home, not that they can drive in every day.
Right. It's good to know that there's a bit of research going on there. And of course, there has been a long-term trend. I think in the 1990s there were organisations like Mintel, just reporting on the exodus of people outside from out of conurbations into the countryside and small market towns in search of, I don't know, reduced crime, less pollution, better education for their children. So that there is a long-term issue there. What else have we got? Which measures, can I ask the panel, which of the measures that you've talked about are the least contentious? Which are the most contentious? And what would you advise a local authority who might not be on the cutting edge? And I think we've been very privileged this afternoon to have such progressive authorities and living streets representatives here with us. So what would you advise a Borsetshire County Council in terms of moving forward in a most practicable and least contentious way?
I'm happy to kick off if that's helpful. I mean, I think it's all relative, Robert. So least contentious still produced a significant amount of objection, but where you've got clearly narrow footways outside of retail frontages, it's quite clear that people can't stay 2 metres apart in that space. So removing parking outside that is, I think, the least contentious. And I never thought I would actually say that, but I think that's probably the least contentious. I think taking where you've got taken by a lot of the Leicester pictures where you've got cones in cycle lanes, we've done fairly significant analysis of our network, and we really struggle with that because, of course, vast majority of the roads that we have all have private accesses with off-street car parking in people's front yards and stuff off of it, so you can't really use vertical deflections in those situations. So we're sort of taking our scratching ahead a little bit about that, taking carriageway lanes and making roads that were previously two-way to be one-way. I think that's very controversial, and it also has significant road safety issues, so we need to be careful with that. But beyond everything, I think hard closures of roads that lead to residents have to make significant diversions, I think would always be the most controversial thing that a highway authority could do. But that may just be my own personal experience.
Just an observation. Hi, it's Colin Black here. Just an observation, but it does seem to be that whilst some of our counterparts on the continent are investing heavily in kind of iron-on cycle markings for roads and some really funky road coverings, we're investing heavily in cones, and I wonder whether we could make some of our cycle facilities look a little bit more exciting to use.
Well, just to reflect on that, that's specifically what the DFT says that we shouldn't do. It says that we must use segregation and that road markings and other such paint solutions are unlikely to lead to any long-term change. So if we could, we talked about just making all our advisory lanes mandatory, for example, and maybe putting in, as you say, some funky markings just to try and show that we've done something. But the view is that that doesn't really lead to the change that the DFT is looking for.
So that's interesting. That runs fairly contrary to sort of the design guidance coming out of Berlin that TfL reference in their guidance documents, but an interesting debate for another time.
Indeed, indeed. It might be an Andrew Gilligan one in there.
Andy, would you be able to comment from the Leicester perspective as to the what's going to be controversial and what isn't?
It's a little too early to tell. I was asked in the chat how we're relating to people, how we're communicating the changes that we've introduced or we've got proposed. And they've gone out through the City Council and City Mayor's consultation, conversations, the press release stuff, a lot of social media, and we're monitoring that pretty closely. So we're not at the moment feeling or hearing a lot of negative comments and a lot of feedback. It's difficult to differentiate between one thing and another that we've either done or we're talking about doing over the coming weeks. Certainly things like putting in harder segregation or segregation light segregation along cycle lanes is a no-brainer. It's pretty straightforward. The horizontal space is already defined. It's easy to make them a little bit wider. When objections to kind of widening have been raised in the past, they're not appearing at the moment. And the key thing is we've caveated all of the work that we're doing around the support for key workers to keep us all safe during the imminent or the evident crisis around us. It's very difficult for people to object and very easy for them to understand that if we've provided bikes for huge numbers of ancillary workers in the local hospitals, we also need to provide space for them to safely get to and from that hospital facility from where they live. Very few people would stand up publicly and say that's a bad thing during a crisis in which 30,000 people have died, and the prospect is there's another 30 or 40,000 likely to die before we see the end of this nonsense.
And David and Ruby, the controversy questions. What is the easiest path to follow?
I think I think a kind of quick win in a lot of London, at least, is converting, kind of what Mark was saying. I think converting painted cycle lanes either advisory or mandatory and segregating them. I think that's a really kind of quick win in that way. But I think there are things like, I think big changes, again, it's quite a London specific issue, I suppose, which maybe isn't the point of your question, but the mayor has proposed to close a lot of very major routes through central London, and there are a lot of concerns about that kind of diverting traffic onto local roads and residential roads, and I think those kind of full closures are always going to be very controversial, and maybe that's a difficult direction to go in, kind of taking your question to the other end of the spectrum and saying what would be the most controversial thing.
And David, Dr. Harrison, do you have any thoughts about controversy and how to avoid it? Are you still with us?
I think he sent an email saying that he had to leave, actually.
He had to leave, all right. Well, while you're still on the line, Ruby, your approach is, you reflected the strategic dimension. How would you advise, people have raised the issue about market towns, and you could have cathedral towns, that sort of thing, smaller scale cities, small towns. How should they go about developing some sort of network approach?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to sound like I'm kind of harping on about the same thing, but I really do think that having a kind of holistic approach to that is really important, because you absolutely can't expect to just put in a load of cycle lanes and for people to suddenly become cyclists overnight. It's absolutely not as simple as that, and you also can't rely on there being existing demand if you're hoping to change things. So I think having a program like they're doing in Leicester with their providing bikes to key workers and things like that, I think kind of almost generating the demand yourself and helping to drive the behaviour change in that way is a really smart way of dealing with it, and it kind of backs up your use of infrastructure in that sense, which obviously the DFT are pushing for.
Yeah, that's a very telling point. Cycle sales have been running at about 3 million per annum, at least over the last 10 years. So there should be as many bicycles in the population as there are people. But I know I've got one bicycle. I have several bicycles, but one of them you can't turn the handlebars because it's all rusted. So it looks as though we've got we have cyclists in being, but they're not going to instantaneously come out of thin air.
Sorry, I think we have all the tools to kind of make that happen. You know, we have all the kind of cycle proficiency, Dr. Bike type, relatively local, small scale kind of interventions that kind of get those people up and running. And it's, somebody made the point in the chat about like £2 billion sounding pretty cheap in comparison to HS2, and I think that's the case with walking and cycling interventions in general, is that their cost benefit always comes out really good if you you count all the true benefits. So
yeah, there used to be something called the National Obesity Observatory before it got scrapped, and I think 5 years ago they produced some projections as to future obesity and overweight trends. And I recall one of their projections: normal weight men would become extinct in about 2050, and I know I could do with shedding a couple of stone. So, yeah.
Robert, could I just pick up on something that Ruby's said there? I absolutely agree in terms of the idea, the principle or the concept of kind of generating demand. But really, in Leicester, we're not generating demand. We're responding to need. As I say, 40% of households in the city don't have access to a car. People have previously gotten to essential frontline services and workplaces using public transport, and really that is no longer available to them. We've had cases like personal conversations with people to whom we've given a bike following their requests, and they've been walking an hour to get to a care home, carrying out a shift and walking home. It's not a question of when I've described it as opportunism, it probably sounds flippant. Really, it's not. It's the basic principles of serving the public and the residents of the city and responding to the needs that present themselves when circumstances have changed beyond the controls that we've been familiar with in the past. It's there. The need is there, and it'll be the same in London. It'll be the same in Manchester and most other towns and cities throughout the country. People who are bus dependent can't get to the services. They still need to get to work, and thankfully they're still doing that in huge numbers, and they're helping the rest of us. It's beholden on the City Council here, as it is in every other local authority, to recognise that, to respond to it in a holistic way, giving people bikes, teaching them to ride, and providing some cones down a road is not a lot to ask in the circumstances in which their need is expressed.
And did you happen to manage a ballpark calculation of the cost of pop-up cycle lanes per kilometre?
Yeah, it's a bit sketchy, but I reckon it's about 8k per mile. Where you're putting cones in. That's for the purchase of new cones and some of the time involved in shipping them in, and about 20k when you're looking at bolt down ones.
Great.
Multiply that as much as you like to.
Okay, and is that pop-up lanes on both sides of the street?
Well, that's a single site, unidirectional. Yeah.
Okay.
That's a very sketchy estimate. Don't take it verbatim.
Unless somebody can come up with a cheaper price, you get the contract, I reckon.
Robert.
Yeah.
Robert, I'm going to jump in here because we've done over 2 hours marathon. Well done. And the numbers have dropped down quite a lot in the last 20 minutes or so. So I've thought, well, this is usually the point where we stop the formal discussion. But if people want to hang around and chat one-to-one without it being facilitated, as it were, I'm happy to keep the channel open, right?